Great. Well, thanks so much, Alec, and thanks to everyone who's presented so far for a really rich conference. I'm very excited to be speaking at this kind of turning point where we sort of pivoting from considering automation technology to thinking about the gig economy and platforms. So yes, we have Back to the Future of Work. When I realized I was the only one giving a really historical talk, I decided to kind of hammer up a bit. So platforms, the paradigm like Uber, create a digital marketplace, usually algorithmically mediated, where consumers can hire ostensibly independent workers who are not formal employees of the platform company to provide services such as ride sharing and food delivery. Digital platforms are at the heart of the so-called gig economy. The erosion of formal employment as it was institutionalized in the mid-20th century welfare capitalist economies like the United States. In the world of the gig economy, at least in its self-conception, masses of little cash-strapped entrepreneurs pay a fee or a portion of their earnings to a big billionaire entrepreneur for the ability to conduct ostensibly independent business on the big entrepreneur's platform. These workers are in a way thought to imbibe entrepreneurialism from their non-boss bosses. In recent years, a variety of analysts have observed that the system bears more than a passing resemblance to the land tenure system of feudalist Europe. Feudal vassals, like gig economy independent contractors, were not wage laborers. They own their means of production and receive market income as a direct payment for surplus goods they sold. To access land, vassals needed to pay a portion of their surplus to, and often perform military service for, a lord. No land without a lord, as the law of William the Conqueror's England had. The lord, in turn, could strip vassals of their land if they fell out of favor, an experience perhaps familiar to Uber drivers kicked off the platform for performing poorly in the app's notoriously racially biased customer evaluation system. Nonetheless, while the feudalism analogy is rhetorically piquant and often sketched out with considerable ingenuity, the gig economy, I believe, has considerably more recent antecedents. 21st century platform capitalism should not be understood as a historical corruption, reversion to the feudalist past, but rather as the perfection of nearly a century of experimentation with entrepreneurial schemes of labor organization. Its ancestors are less the fields of Norman England and more the distributorships of Amway and other multi-level marketing schemes. Before them, the independent contractors of early direct selling companies like Igor. These firms, like platform startups, all presented themselves as entrepreneurial initiatives that worked by creating new opportunities for entrepreneurship, in turn, on a mass scale. All the digital platforms have done ultimately is to use the internet to lower barriers to entry even further and to intensify the atomization of the workforce, and to use algorithmic feedback to enhance firms' capacity to discipline workers without direct managerial supervision. As a method of structuring the employment relation, digital platforms differ in few important respects from the direct selling industry, one of the most important sectors of 20th century consumer capitalism. The culture of platform work, particularly the entrepreneurial self-conception platforms are often said to foster, is, in historical perspective, even less novel. This is a major argument that runs through my book, Make Your Own Job, which is coming out next year from Georgia University Press. Today, I want to zero in on these two cases, Avon and Amway, which I think illustrate this point most clearly. So, first stop in our DeLorean would be the Depression-era United States. And the modern direct selling industry really came into its own. From the 1920s to the 1940s, direct selling transformed from a means to an end. While producers had long utilized direct-to-consumer sales to market their products, in this period, companies turned this formula on its head, coming up with new product lines in order to engage in direct selling. This transformation in some ways represented a departure from the tendency of early 20th century American capitalism towards the absorption of salespeople into the bureaucratically managed workforces of large corporations. In direct selling, the peddler of yore was reborn, not merely as atavism, but as a symbol of the enduring entrepreneurial ingenuity of American working people. While some early 20th century executives hoped to create a Tayloristic science of selling that would allow managers to specify precisely the most efficient procedures for sales workers, the direct selling workforce, unsupervised on a day-to-day basis, relied by necessity on initiative and interpersonal skill. For industry advocates, this contrast was at the heart of direct selling's seemingly miraculous ability to prosper during the Depression. When men in all other lines of commerce are discouraged, and many lie down abandoning the struggle, the pitchman goes courageously on, wrote James Furman, a traveling salesman known by his nom de guerre, the Great Pizarro, in the sales magazine The Billboard in 1942. The inner resolve of the pitchman insulated him from the vicissitudes of the conventional labor market. The pitchman needs ask no man for a job, according to the Great Pizarro. Rather, quote, he creates his own job. Organizational innovations in industry during the 30s bolstered Brewster's claims that direct selling work was a form of self-employment and thus the fruit of individual entrepreneurial initiative. After unsuccessfully experimenting in the late 1920s with schemes to organize sales workers as salaried corporate employees, a few prominent direct selling firms, most notably the California Perfume Company, shifted in the early 30s to a model which treated sellers as formally independent business people who purchased their wares from the manufacturer and resold them to consumers. This model quickly became the industry standard in the wake of the momentous New Deal labor reforms of the mid-30s. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which created a right for many private sector workers to unionize. The Social Security Act of 1935, whose signature federal retirement and disability benefits program was funded through new behavioral tax paid by employers. And, as we heard about last night, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which created rights to a federal minimum wage and time and a half of overtime pay. In 1936, the National Association of Direct Selling Companies successfully petitioned the Federal Trade Commission to certify that direct sales representatives employed as independent contractors were not considered company employees for the purposes of the major New Deal legislation. Companies didn't have to submit payroll taxes on their behalf or contribute to unemployment relief. Direct sales workers had no right to unionize, and they were exempt from wages and hours regulations. By the decade's close, more or less all direct selling companies told their sales forces what the California Perfume Company had long told the distributors of its Avon product line: now you are in business for yourself. The FTC apparently agreed. The spread of the independent contractor model is just one more factor driving direct selling companies to adopt what I call an entrepreneurial rather than a scientific management style. That is to say, an approach to management that required workers to internalize the company's mission and objectives as their own, and to exercise their initiative in discharging their responsibilities, relying on the market for feedback, rather than submitting to precise, ostensibly scientific instructions from higher-ups. Even if salespeople were treated on paper as corporate employees, the latter method would have been intractable in managing an overwhelmingly rural sales force like that of the California Perfume Company. 80% of Avon sellers lived in towns of 2,500 or fewer, mostly located west of the Mississippi River. Instead, CPC turned to the central instrument of entrepreneurial management in the direct selling industry: inspirational company literature. All registered sellers received the Avon Outlook at least once every month. The pamphlet included up-to-date information about the Avon product line and other practical and logistical information, but it also sought to inculcate the company's success philosophy and to encourage sellers to devote themselves enthusiastically to their work. The Avon Outlook taught distributors a new language, as CPC executives explained how best to guide your Avon business through the endless succession of sales campaigns waged seasonally by the company. The ultimate function of the independent contractor model is not exactly to isolate the individual seller from the company, but to create a fantasy of equal status, a level playing field on which sellers could approach CPC executives as co-creators of the firm's success. If this fantasy allowed distributors to share the glory of the company's booming sales during the 30s, it also placed the responsibility for individual failure squarely on their shoulders. When you join the ranks of the Avon organization, your future success is in your hands, the Outlook wrote. How you capitalize it depends on your own efforts. There's much more to say about Avon. If you'd like to learn more, I highly recommend Katina Manko's excellent monograph, Ding Dong Avon Call. But for now, we must leave the CPC behind and ride our DeLorean into Grand Rapids, Michigan, into the age of Reagan. The home turf of Amway, the company which transformed direct selling into multi-level marketing. By the early 80s, Amway products were sold throughout the US and the world by roughly 1 million distributors, peddling the fruit of the labor of several thousand manufacturing workers at the Amway plant in Ada, Michigan. The company's founders, Richard DeVos and Jay Van Andel, were explicit that the purpose of the company was, in their eyes, to create as many distributors as possible. Primary production was just a means to this end. Our dream, Van Andel explained in 1979, is to become nationwide, then worldwide, and to offer an entrepreneurial opportunity to average men and women. Amway presented an entrepreneurial opportunity to its distributors because, following the lead of earlier direct selling firms, every single one of them was technically not an employee, but an independent contractor. This organizational maneuver helped ensure that Amway's description of its employees as entrepreneurs was widely accepted, both inside and outside of the company. The heart of Amway is its distributors, each one an entrepreneur, a profile of Van Andel, the nation's business reporter. Amway's products were not sold in stores, one of its publicists explained, but by independent distributors who own their own businesses and sell products to friends and acquaintances. Entrepreneurship in Amway entailed more than just independent business ownership. The contractor structure wasn't new in the industry, as we've seen. In fact, at the time of its founding, in 1959, DeVos and Van Andel operated a distributorship in Michigan for the vitamin company Nutrol. But Amway was one of the earliest and by far the most successful adopter of a new model of direct selling known as multi-level marketing or network direct selling. The precise details varied from firm to firm, but the common denominator was that successful MLM distributors would make the most of their money not from their personal sales, but through incentives attached to their recruitment of new sellers into the organization. In Amway, recruitment incentives took the form of commissions paid to sponsors as a percentage of their recruit sales, and their recruit sales, so on down the pyramid. The word is unavoidable, although in 1979, the Federal Trade Commission ruled that while Amway had made, quote, false and misleading earnings claims in attempting to recruit persons to serve as distributors, it was not technically an illegal pyramid scheme, because compensation for recruitment was ultimately tied at some point to the sale of real products. But sponsorship is the only way to make real money in Amway, as the 97% of active distributors who failed to break even in Amway by one estimate discovered to their dismay. What's more, sponsorship was often the only way to sell. Amway products were typically more expensive than brand name alternatives in stores, so the most willing consumers were new distributors who needed to purchase inventory from their sponsor and who were pressured into exclusively using Amway products in their own homes. Besides fueling its astonishing rate of expansion, the centrality of sponsorship to Amway's business model was an ideological asset in DeVos and Van Andel's quest to create an army of true-believing, self-identifying entrepreneurs. First, it ensured that the typical distributor was not just an independent contractor, but in the Amway lexicon, a leader. To make money, sponsors had to secure the goodwill of their subordinates, keep their spirits up, and ensure that they were enthusiastically sponsoring others in turn. The lesson was that successful leadership in business was a relationship of consent, not domination. Quote, leadership implies getting the job done through people, and that process requires mutual respect, DeVos wrote in his memoir and manifesto, Believe. The models for leadership in Amway were, of course, DeVos and Van Andel themselves, who were the subjects of an intense cult of personality. Accompanying literature informed distributors that it was unheard of for DeVos to ever lose his temper, ever show an unpleasant side, ever get angry or impatient. Distributors also learned that DeVos and Van Andel's personal leadership presence had single-handedly saved the Ada factory from unionization, which was true in a way. When the resale, wholesale, and department store union made a run at the plant in the mid-60s, DeVos held weekly rallies on the shop floor with mandatory attendance, where he sermonized on the evils of unions until whatever momentum and drive had accumulated petered out for good. By requiring distributors to make their own attempt at leadership within their sponsorship network, Amway encouraged its sales force to see themselves not just as petty contractors, but as small-scale participants in the same spirit of entrepreneurship embodied by DeVos and Van Andel, and to see leadership, rather than exploitation or coercion, as the motive force of success in the capitalist economy. The imperative to sponsorship also obligated distributors to internalize Amway's narrative about the merits of its distinctly entrepreneurial mode of work, in order to convincingly repeat it to its recruits. Most people were stuck in the rut, according to the story that sponsors were supposed to repeat at pitch meetings. We go back and forth every day from home to work, We punch a clock morning, noon, and night. We spend 40 years working for somebody else and retire at 65 on enough Social Security to buy a year's supply of dog food. Plenty of leftists and labor movement activists saw matters similarly, of course. But their explanation that the rut was imposed on people by the fundamental structure of capitalist society is a lie, according to Amway. Anyone could break out and achieve the dream if they applied themselves. I have a firm conviction that almost anyone can do what he really believes he can do, DeVos insisted, a message repeated incessantly by positive thinking evangelists like Norman Vincent Peale at Amway rallies, and on the self-improvement cassette tapes that distributors were strongly encouraged to buy from their sponsors. Amway distributors escape the rut simply by taking their own responsibility for their condition in life, DeVos maintained. His picture of the successful Amway distributor has more than a little in common with the memes of today's online hustle culture influencers. They've given up watching television every night, that Saturday golf schedule, or that time when they formerly just sat around and did nothing. They're out selling Amway products and sharing the Amway program to make extra money for the things they want but can't afford. The difference between the Amway life, entrepreneurial work and luxury consumption, and the ordinary life, routine work and your job, just boiled down to effort and attitude. So, back to the present, back to the future. This contrast between entrepreneurial jobs and those that just pay the bills is central to the rhetoric of today's gig economy boosters. With striking unanimity, today's platform firms insist on describing their own armies of non-employee employees as entrepreneurs. The gig economy Fiverr CEO Mike Kaufman writes in Wired, is just another name for the labor force of new entrepreneurs. Without a hint of internal contradiction, Uber executive Nina Harris extols the millions of, quote, full-fledged entrepreneurs that rely on our platform. Gig economy's extensive propaganda on this front does not merely serve a public relations role, but discharges an important managerial function, much like the relentless inspirational messaging of the direct selling industry. While some gig workers find their labor process finely controlled by digital algorithms, some companies, consider Etsy for example, where 1.4 million craft sellers, use the platform structure to bestow a certain degree of autonomy on makers. And in all cases, the very low barrier to entry that is the foundation of the platform business model creates managerial risk, as Julia was explaining earlier, a similarly low barrier to exit and the potential for sparing or ad hoc usage. That is a dilemma no algorithm can solve. Here you can see DoorDash drivers on Reddit asking each other for motivational tips. There are literally tens of thousands of these threads. And this is just one platform. So the gig economy firms have developed a massive arsenal of motivational messaging techniques. So this is a very notorious ad in Fiverr. On one side, on the top, this is a story that kind of went viral. There was a Lyft driver that gave birth in her Lyft drive while driving, and there was the Lyft company blog posted this story on its blog as a kind of triumph, and it gave the new mother a little Miss Lyft onesie for the baby, and shared this photo. And then here's again more DoorDashers, inspirational stories from DoorDashers explaining what keeps them motivated. Even a lot of critical analysts have framed this kind of hustle culture as a distinctive characteristic of the gig economy. But as we've seen, in many ways, it's ripping a page straight out of the direct selling playbook. Nonetheless, many analysts in both the media and the academy have framed the rise of the gig economy as a basically irreversible change wrought by the development of new technologies. Gig economy platforms are creating a new class of entrepreneurs, announces, fittingly enough, Entrepreneur Magazine. Even analysts who acknowledge the potential for exploitation in the gig economy are often loath to question the underlying assumption that digital platforms are, at least ideally speaking, engines of entrepreneurship. The rise of the sharing economy, writes the NYU economist Arun Sundararajan, poses a social choice between two contrasting future worlds of work, one populated by disenfranchised drones and one by empowered entrepreneurs. The advance of platform capitalism can't be stopped. The task is to ensure it will function as a tool for promoting entrepreneurship rather than serfdom. I think that attending to the continuities in organizational and ideological structure between today's platform capitalism and the past gig economies of the direct selling industry can help loosen the grip of the technological determinism that seems to me to lurk behind such pronouncements. The key tool enabling companies such as Amway and Avon to create workforces of ostensible entrepreneurs was no state-of-the-art Silicon Valley technology. Rather, it was the acquiescence of the regulatory state, especially the Federal Trade Commission and the National Labor Relations Board. This tool, in turn, operated in the broader context of worker disempowerment. The failure of the 20th century labor movement to make inroads into the southern and western rural and small-town communities from which the California Perfume Company drew most of its workforce, and the demolition by deindustrialization and Reagan administration policy of unionism in the Rust Belt states like Michigan, where Amway got its start. The rise of the first gig economy, in short, is at heart a political rather than technological phenomenon. I believe the same is true of the rise of the new gig economy today. Thanks.
Test just in case. Well, first I'd like to thank Alec and the conference organizers for putting together a wonderful conference. I learned a lot, and I look forward to learning more. I suppose I will begin with what has been called the anxieties in this conference, and we'll proceed to the hopes, and hopefully you can help me with the hopeful part at the end. I'm interested, we're interested, G and I, in the continued relevance of membership, right, in the context of platform capitalism and the gig economy. But first, let's start with the anxieties and the challenges. The gig economy has witnessed substantial growth over the years. A study from 2019 indicated that by 2015, almost 60% of US workers were part of the gig economy. Coinciding with this trend, novel methods of workplace control and surveillance have emerged, largely spurred by the transformation of time and space dynamics. This shift is attributed to the proliferation of digital platforms coordinating work. With the rise of platforms like Uber, Upwork, Lyft, it is anticipated that conventional workplaces characterized by a stable cohort of colleagues and a tangible work setting promoting social interaction will give way to digital environments that prioritize flexibility in co-working relationships and settings. As Richard Sennett, loved and hated, contended nearly 2 decades ago, a new capitalism, as he put it, necessitates flexibility and instability in workplaces as fundamental elements. An implication derived from Sennett's works is that the increasing prevalence of flexibility and instability leads to what he called, quote, the corrosion of character, end quote. This phrase means that the transformation in traits that were once prevalent in traditional long-term society-like workplaces, commitment, loyalty, for instance, which have subsequently become increasingly obsolete. When referring to traditional workplaces, we are discussing elements characterized by 3 main features: spatial, temporal, and social. Spatially, employees in such settings anticipate collaborating within a shared physical space. Temporally, there's an expectation of a relatively prolonged duration of employment, with a substantial portion of one's waking hours spent at the workplace. Socially, given the spatial and temporal dimensions of these workplaces, there is an anticipation of engaging in meaningful social interactions, leading employees to expect the development of strong bonds, ties, and relationship with their colleagues in the workplace. Indeed, the role of the workplace as a crucial arena for socialization has been acknowledged by sociologists and legal scholars. Cynthia Estlund, in particular, discovered and noted that the workplace serves as a central setting where the majority of working adults are anticipated to engage with others and to develop conflict resolution skills. She notes that, quote, the instrumental and even the hierarchical dimensions of workplace relations help bring individuals together across lines of social division that they would not otherwise choose to cross, and to make potentially conflict-ridden interactions relatively constructive, end quote. This insight by Estlund demonstrates the transformative potential of workplace interactions, highlighting their ability to foster unity and constructive dialogue across diverse social groups. Crucially, this also demonstrates that the workplace often functions as a mini community, a setting where individuals gain a sense of satisfaction, cultivate civic skills, and experience personal growth, among other benefits. Given the significant role that the workplace plays in individual lives, it becomes clear why many tend to feel like members of work organizations. However, the advancement of digitalization has played a part in diminishing this sense of membership, this is what we're interested in, associated with the traditional workplace, affecting it in three distinct ways. First, the workplace has experienced a transformative trend through digitalization, a phenomenon that sociologists and scholars in communication studies refer to as the platformatization of society. This shift has profound implications for labor and work, one of which is the taskification of work. Taskification can be defined as, quote, the reduction of human activities to the smallest conceivable unit of execution. In this context, platforms emerge as convenient tools for the effortless outsourcing of specific tasks, consequently challenging the economic justification for maintaining an internal organizational structure to handle tasks that can now be externalized. Put differently, the unique value of platforms stems directly from their ability to disrupt and erode traditional production systems where tasks were previously integrated into collective, collaborative efforts. With the traditional organizational structure now being disrupted and fragmented, employees find themselves increasingly working in isolated and atomized ways. In other words, the erosion of the traditional organizational structure also represents the erosion of the potential communal structure that was built into such an organizational structure in the first place. Secondly, the digital transformation of the workplace brings with it the fragmentation of physical interactions between individuals. As Richardson notes, digital technologies enable, quote, the dispersal of office work from physical office buildings. Some researchers have found a trend in contemporary workplaces towards a post-bureaucratic organizational structure. In such a trend, the office transforms into a more flexible space, serving temporary purposes for specific work tasks that cannot be completed remotely, as opposed to adhering to a specific functionality. In simpler terms, the trend in modern workplaces is increasing towards coordinating work through digital means rather than within a shared physical space. However, this transformation should not be viewed merely as an efficiency gain in organizational structure. It also represents a social loss, as the daily interactions that occur within a physical space tend to diminish. As pointed out by a firm specializing in office space, we spend, quote, so much time, there's how this office space looks and how it flows is crucial, so that the ability to use that space to work, meet, and have fun diminishes. In other words, the digitalization of the workplace is gradually causing the communal lives and interactions that had once flourished in shared physical spaces to fade away. Thirdly, the progression towards a digital workplace has significantly contributed to the fragmentation of work time. As work becomes more task-oriented and as the shared physical space becomes less and less vital for coordinating work-related activities, an additional consequence is the increasing fragmentation of time. This is due to the digitalization of the workplace, which allows for tasks to be allocated to workers based on real-time demands. And there are several examples we can discuss. Some scholars have referred to this phenomenon as the Uberization of work. It is important to note that the establishment of communal ties within workplaces hinges on the simultaneous presence of workers. The shared time lays the groundwork or foundation for social interactions and bonds to form in the work environment, and that's being undermined. In sum, or to summarize, the digitalization of the workplace has unveiled three major trends, each of which carries significant implications for the notions of community and membership within contemporary workplaces. First, the taskification of work has dramatically altered corporate firm structures, leading to a state where workers find themselves increasingly isolated and atomized. Secondly, the digital transformation of workplaces has resulted in the gradual obsolescence of shared communal physical spaces. Lastly, the phenomenon coined as the Uberization of work has fragmented the collective time spent at work community, undermining the temporal foundation essential for fostering social interaction within the workplace. Collectively, these three trends pose substantial challenges to the conventional conception of the workplace as a community, or mini community if you prefer, where membership and a sense of belonging play crucial roles in shaping the normative values within the workplace. So you may ask, if the three major trends described continue to undermine the traditional senses of belonging, community, and in the word membership, why should we bother to rethink membership at all, or in the first place? Our main response to this challenge is that membership is intricately bound up with justice. And not just justice in general, but justice in production. Although we do not share his communitarian rendition of membership, we agree with Michael Walzer's argument that, quote, the idea of distributive justice presupposes a bounded world within which distributions take place, a group of people committed to dividing, exchanging, and sharing social goods, first of all, among themselves. The evolving digital workplace, we argue, remains a key case in point. Workers' rights. That's how we push back. Walzer is by no means the first philosopher to adopt a bounded conception of justice that is tethered to membership rights. Hegel famously saw corporate membership, this is in the philosophy of life, as the only way of securing a sense of universality by way of particularity in a characteristically fragmented, nascent, capitalist civil society. For the same reason, it should be added, Hegel thought he was justified in denying casual workers corporate membership rights because, quote, they are prepared to undertake casual employment on a single occasion and on many other subsequent occasions, we could add, end quote. Notwithstanding his impressive insights into the contradictory dynamics of capitalist civil society, Hegel did not anticipate the proliferation of the precariat class with the advent of the digital workplace and the gig economy. Though to his credit, he did anticipate the emergence of an independent rabble of paupers in that same work. Those profound transformations that we've discussed so far have led Guy Standing to suggest that unions are ill-equipped to protect the material interests of precarious workers, and that a universal basic income is the only realistic way forward. Be that as it may, we do not think that the category of membership is either empirically or normatively obsolete. We maintain that membership must be rethought rather than dismissed as fundamentally outdated in connection with the political challenges and opportunities presented by digital workplaces and platform capitalism. While the concept of membership may be less thick in this brave new digital world, it will continue to inform ethical or normative expectations regarding how firms ought to treat their workers, assuming as we do, for the time being, that we remain a long way away from the digital workplace autonomy and self-management ideas. Notwithstanding the fragmentation associated with platform capitalism, recent scholarship has also shown that Uber and Lyft workers have begun collectively agitating for greater regulation of the workplaces, despite continued efforts by these very corporations to limit the legal status of these workers to that of independent contractors, something that has come up a few times so far. Most recently, Figueres and Vina Dubal have argued that the anti-regulatory strategies deployed by Uber and Lyft, among other platform corporations, mirror earlier tactics used by industrial capitalist firms to undermine the rights of workers. The accompanying counter-movement, I borrow from Karl Polanyi here, of industrial workers previously took the form of protracted struggles for workplace protections and legal limits on the length of the working day. The spirit of these struggles carries over into the digital workplace in varied ways, assuming as we do that the category of membership does not and should not lose its normative salience under platform capitalism. To be sure, this does not make membership into some kind of panacea, but it does serve as a helpful reminder that gig workers share more in common with each other than they do with their corporate employers, even if they no longer share the same physical workplace, perform tasks in unison, or spend sufficient time working together. It is high time that we rethink the centrality of membership in the digital workplace. And the way we see it is as transitioning from, you could say, a thinner sense of membership as pushing back, the counter-movement pushing back against greater and greater flexibility and precariousness, to combining forces through attempts at unionization and collective bargaining, collective agitation, to digital workplace autonomy and self-management. And believe it or not, for the first stage, there is a quote I would like to take from Karl Marx regarding this process of organizing pushing for legal constraints on exploitation. This is in his work on the international. They, the working class, know, I'm quoting here, that before everything else, the children and juvenile workers must be saved from the crushing effects of the present system. This can only be effected by converting social reason into social force. And under given circumstances, there exists no other method of doing so than through general laws enforced by the power of the state. In enforcing such laws, the working class do not fortify governmental power. On the contrary, they transform that power, now used against them, into their own agency. They effect, by a general act, what they would vainly attempt by a multitude of isolated individual efforts. End quote. So the first stage in this reclaiming of membership begins with a pushback against greater and greater precariousness and atomization. So we'd like to argue that the concept of membership isn't passé, that it has to be reclaimed, and it has to be reclaimed in this digital brave new world of ours. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Okay, so I will walk the mic around. Good, you can have a seat, absolutely. So we got about 25 minutes for Q&A. So for either of our speakers.
Just on this last talk, I definitely agree with you that the kind of factor is the paradigmatic circumstance that you would expect collective identity to develop, as opposed to the distributed and decentralized kinds of thing we were talking about with the kids. But I thought with the Amazon organizing and the ALU and also the Starbucks campaign, that there's been significant progress in using social media to try to build some of the lateral expert corporate communication channels that would be available for that kind of community. We had a talk actually last year from a woman who studied was in Indonesia, and a successful gig workers or even drivers who had organized a union, and it was in fact because they had organized a physical space, a kind of pit stop coffee shop for all the gig workers, and because of that space, they were able to do the collective identity that you're talking about. But I keep hoping that a fuller bandwidth future with various kinds of electronic communication would provide the opportunities for the kinds of collective belonging and identity, perhaps thinner, but at least, you know, as full as we could get it.
Does this thing work? Yes. Well, I agree. I can't say much except for, you know, I'm just as hopeful, right? But I think we also have to be realistic in terms of our expectations for the kind of retrieval of a sense of belonging. It's a different kind of workplace. It's a lot more competitive. It's a lot more atomizing. But these are promising steps forward. And I guess in a rather subversive way, one could say that if, you know, capitalist firms are able to draw lessons from the past, why can't the workers in a different era? So, you know, we see a return to combinations and collective attempts and pushing back against various new forms of exploitation. But I remain hopeful. But we just can't posit it as an ideal. My ideal may be, you know, workplace self-management, but there's a long way before we get there. And so the more experiments, the more examples there are, you know, the more hopeful I am, we are, I should say. But I agree with you, and the hope is that there'll be more and more of that as part of this counter movement, right, which we see in the digital image.
This question is for Erik. I really like that way you describe the kind of eras from direct selling to MLM to the contemporary gig economy. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to like the differences between the eras, because my mom actually got involved in one of these MLM schemes. I think it's called Elabuca. It's like just a copy, kind of natural products version of Amway. And you know, the thing about it that's really sad is obviously that people who get it late don't make very much money. But the thing that I found so disturbing about it is that like these pyramid schemes are about monetizing your personal relationships, right? It's like basically like a kind of thing of all of your family members and your friends become potential employees, and it's kind of like it exacts a real social cost, right, in terms of that dimension of it, like the personal dimension. And it seems to me like something important about the gig economy, and I was trying to think if there are any counterexamples about this. It really is like very anonymous. You know what I mean? Like the drivers of Uber aren't like I'm curious if there are any examples in the gig economy where there's this entrepreneurial dimension with regard to your own personal relationships. And so I was wondering if that was one thing that struck me, and then the other thing is that maybe compared to the direct sellers of the earlier period, a lot of the gig workers, like you cited that figure, like 15%, and it's really different whether it's whether people are moonlighting or doing it full time. And that if you ask what percentage are actual full time drivers of Uber, let's say, it's like a much smaller number. But that in itself seems really important. Like Julie Shore was asking me questions relative to that aspect of the gig economy when I was talking that a lot of these people are like moonlighting. It's like a supplement job. So I'm just wondering maybe some of that, like if you could say more about what seems sort of relative to that historical background, what seems unique to you about it?
Yeah, terrific questions. And I should say there's a great degree of both heterogeneity and overlap. There are still relatively conventional direct selling operations. There are obviously still a lot of multi-level marketing operations in existence. And that, of course, is, I think there's something singularly pernicious and scammy about the MLM world that's not, that's one area of disanalogy, I think, to consider the platform. I think that the degree of impersonality that you just described is more novel than the part-time aspect of it. A lot of the issue of how many of these people are actually, doing this full-time for a living was something that executives at both CDC and AMA were perturbed about. At CDC, they actually tried to convert it into a positive, because the vast majority of Avon sellers were women. And so the argument that they made was that this is something that you can do to augment your primary identity as a homemaker and another. Whereas other direct selling companies with a more overwhelmingly male workforce, that line of argumentation is less sort of ideologically accessible to them, so they were more troubled about this, and there was a certain degree of, some experimented with quotas for how much you had to purchase a certain amount, so that if you did not spend enough time selling, you would be essentially on the hook for that quantity of goods that you didn't sell. So that aspect I do think is relatively, there's a fair degree of continuity there. I think the point about impersonality is really spot on, especially compared to Amway. I think the possible exceptions, there are some of these operations. The digital platform that reminds me the most of these earlier operations is definitely Etsy, which is not as big, but it does have, again, well over 1 million active sellers on the platform. And there are a lot of Etsy sellers, especially who are starting up their operations, are definitely encouraged to work their connections and commercialize their relationships. The other aspect is that some sort of gig marketing firms, and Booker and Duffy has a great book about this, there's a degree of commercialization, not necessarily so much about personal relationships, definitely of the self, and sort of branding and constructing, commodifying one's sort of personality interests, things like that, that are again, that rhetoric of turning yourself into a business. This is something that I trace in the quantum, going back to the turn of the 20th century in this movement. So again, the other thing, I mean, the biggest discontinuity, I think, is that digital selling or direct selling and multi-level marketing, there's I think it's a somewhat more homogenous space than the gig economy today. These operations, there's a degree of difference in terms of geography, some aspects of culture, demographics, but they're all kind of the same thing. And the real innovation is like whether there's this network or pyramid aspect. Whereas the platform space is extremely capacious. There's lots of like Etsy and Uber, for example, have a lot in common, but there's also a lot that's different. I mean, I think that degree of heterogeneity is itself perhaps the most novel thing about the gig economy compared to the direct selling.
Thanks. Those were great presentations. Thank you. Erik, you are to be recommended for having come up with a whole new sort of take on the gig economy. I mean, there's been so much written on it that, at some point I'm like, how can there be anything to say? And obviously you have come up with something really interesting. This is just a small empirical question. Most gig workers today do not think of themselves as entrepreneurs. A few do, but very few. I'm curious about how the people in Amway and Avon, and if you have a sense of how much they adopted that identity.
Yeah, it's a terrific question, and one that I've really struggled with. I mean, the amazing thing about the gig economy is that there's been so much social science going on accompanying the rise of the gig economy. It's been so elaborately studied, and that was definitely not the case in the Avon world, and even less in the Amway world. The other difficulty is this real hierarchy in terms of active participation. So, the successful, I said 97%, this is, a figure from the late 1970s, I believe that was, that they were not making any money. A lot of them weren't even particularly active. I mean, the most involvement in the organization, the most money making, came from these people who were supervising and recruiting more people into the organization. They definitely thought of themselves as entrepreneurs. So, general, but again, they're in the grand scheme of things, they may be a small fraction of the workforce. I mean, I think there's also some degree of again, kind of difference in platform, difference maybe in geography. And I used to work with some friends who were involved in the independent drivers guild, which has a really interesting Massachusetts chapter. And one friend of mine was involved in organizing this ballot initiative, and working with the drivers. I mean, sometimes seemed to him, and maybe again this is anecdotal, but it seemed that there's the question of labels on the one hand, and then there's a question of these more intangible sort of forms of self. And a lot of people bristle against they don't want to be. They reject the sort of entrepreneur stuff, but they also don't want to be thought of as like just normal employee. They do recognize a degree of difference. And I think fairly, I think it's worth considering why do people not want to be employees? So I think that's all to say it's an unsatisfying answer, because again I think there's a lot of internal differentiation in these questions, and also a lack of comparable quantitative, sociological evidence in these early areas.
Just one little point back on that, which is that it's similar to gig laborers, to gig workers today. There are a lot of people who sign up and watch.
Exactly,
so that's another dimension of similarity.
Yeah.
I just wonder, when you talk about the platform capitalism or platform, did you pay attention to the differences between the different kind of platform companies and also the evolution in the business model that occurred in different kind of platform. For example, when Uber started, it's not really designed for people to drive full time. It was supposed for people who have cars to share their car ride with other people, right? But then when this platform become available, then you come people who actually buy cars so that they can provide like a taxi service on the platform. So much so that it actually disrupted the taxi industry. Same with Airbnb, when you have Airbnb who's supposed to, sublet the spare room, and then you have people actually proactively buy apartment or other kind of property to host their property as like a hotel on the Airbnb. So those kind of changes or evolution in the business model, not to say that the platform's own governance policy change over time. How would that change the dynamics between the gig workers or all the parties, stakeholders that have something to do with the platform? Thank you.
Well, I think that Juliette's book After the Gig is, I think, really excellent examination of this sort of sharing, the initial sharing vision and what happened. From my perspective, as that sharing, if that sort of initial sharing economy vision flourished more, I would see less continuity, and there isn't really an analogy there with the direct side world as much. So, as it sort of morphed into what it's become, I think that's a fair point. That there's almost a degree of convergence, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, and in our case, right, we're looking at something very specific and definite, right? Whether membership has a future in the context of the digital platform, capitalist sense of the economy. And there you look at kind of general trends, and they've been towards atomization, right, rather than combination, bringing people together. But I kind of also, I'm open to the view that it could have been different, but I'm a consequentialist in this regard. But let's look at what has been caused by these new fangled systems. And if we're concerned with membership, the rights and freedoms of workers, instead of making workers stronger, it actually makes them weaker as a consequence. But at the same time, there's hope, because workers also work for Ubers and etc. are also responding to this phenomenon as well. So nothing seems to be fixed in stone, but there must be a reason why it's having these consequences, negative consequences, as far as we're concerned, rather than the positive ones. But you could say the jury's still out, right? But it doesn't look very good as far as we're concerned.
Thank you both. This question is for Igor. So in reference to, in Hegel's philosophy of right, the context of corporations corporations are brought up within the context of sort of like unification. So I'm curious what your, sort of that goal of self-management, if you see that as requiring something like a greater external to corporation unification. So whether or not self-management would just result in a different layer of atomization, rather than one that has even the capacity of having that shared identity. It's just like sort of like a chain will problem.
I don't know about the chain will problem. Perhaps we'll start with the system builder, Hegel. So, with Hegel, what's interesting is there's something that's really aspirational and didn't exist in his time. His notion of corporation definitely doesn't exist in our time. The closest thing I can think of is the democratically managed cooperative. The problem is there's an important difference. For Hegel, there is no contradiction between ownership and management. So somehow it all works out. I mean, I'm trivializing a little bit here. But his basic view is that the only way that civil society can be saved, right, is from within, not externally by the state, because the whole basic principle of civil society is particularity, right? right? So the corporation, he says, is like a second family that comes on the scene precisely to fill the gaps that the state cannot fulfill on the very basis of civil society itself, right? Except you create these bonds, right, within the corporation, but the reason you can create these bonds is because you're part of a particular trade, right? And that's what's being undermined, right, with the precariat, right? Because you can't develop these thick bonds. Now, of course, the challenge that you raise is a challenge that extends to worker-owned and democratically managed cooperatives. What will prevent them from exhibiting the same type of pathological competitive tendencies? They also are disinclined after a certain point in time to hire workers. So how can they serve? How can they serve this function of universality rather than just particularity that they can want? And I think that's where the state still has a very important role to play, right? But not to swallow up civil society, right? And to do civil society's part on a Hegelian basis. But to figure out how we can ensure that the rules of the game, or rules of the game, taxes and other policies, are organized such that cooperatives, democratically managed cooperatives, can really achieve that universal function at the local level. Right? I don't know if that's particularly persuasive because we're still struggling to get anywhere close to that. But I think the uniqueness of Hegel's account is that he saw some of these problems, right, before they really blew up in our faces. And the solutions that he provides, the most potent one is the corporation. But its potency is also its greatest weakness because there's no institutional example he can turn to say, well, look, it works in England or it works there. And, you know, never all the ones that are in favor of worker-owned and managed cooperatives turn to Mondragon. That's our example. But it has its own problems as well, as we know. So I think what's great about Hegel's account is it's kind of an aspirational account, but it also tells us, you know, that we need to find the solution within civil society itself rather than looking to the state for all answers to the social, political, economic needs.
Hi, thank you for your talks. This may be a question in the space between you for each or both of you to answer. So when workers, especially in these multi-level marketing companies, encounter failures, right, that's when we might contest the true believer idea that success or failure is up to you in the context of an ideology of meritocracy. And the failures do improve. We heard that question earlier. Soon you have unsold inventory. You're not only not making the money you hope to make, you're losing money. You're doing this alone, so the attribution is often I did something wrong. But in other times when people mobilize, like in micro-mobilization spaces, is when they start making the attributions about failure to themselves and start seeing it in the system. That's when you have like women in internal labor markets or women's groups. I didn't fail to get promoted because of me, women are not getting promoted. So other kind of attributional shift settings. So do you see historically times when people who were failing at MLM found each other and shifted the attributions so that they then weren't true believers? And how do you think more broadly in terms of belonging and membership, there's any prospects for us to kind of de-individualize these self-blaming stories of failure and move toward a system-blaming story?
So historically, there's a very robust community of sort of ex-Amway people, and some of them even there's a vast literature debating whether Amway is best understood as a cult, and there's sort of some of the kind of cult deprogramming world. There are intersections with the ex-Amway, ex-MLM people, but the problem. A lot of people, when people fail in the direct selling scheme, they leave the organization. So they may find community and support, especially for some of the traumatic aspects they may have encountered. But it's at least in that case, historically speaking, it was difficult for them to challenge or even necessarily to feel that their most urgent priority was to kind of take it to the company, except in the sort of, there's a lot of writing and, exposés appearing, from a very early point in Amway's history, in the 70s. and today in the gig economy, again, there are some sort of labor organization initiatives. The Independent Drivers Guild, they have that like deactivation support protocol. So people are deactivated from the app and they believe that it's unfair. There's they have legal resources. They've done some negotiating with the companies to kind of create a channel. So yeah, I think that I find that very promising today. And again, it's sort of, especially seeking like, actually changing, giving people a continued voice in the platform rather than, you fail, you burn out, and in part because it's so toxic, you just want to get the hell out of there, not have anything to do with it again. But there's more of an effort for sort of ongoing, building power among people who are still in the organization.
I guess what I think is when it comes to systemic crises, right? I'm not an immiserationist theorist, if that rings a bell. In large part because I think it can have constructive attributions and can have destructive attributions as well. And that really depends on the kind of the political climate and whether or not the mobilization is there to tilt it in a constructive or let's say critical direction, right? Because atomization can be coupled by further atomization and then attribution to minorities, people already precarious, stealing jobs, etc., etc. And that's where I think the work of politics comes in. It's something that has to be constructed, has to be protected, has to be mobilized. Technology won't be able to generate that, right? And I think that's what kind of will fill the gap and determine whether it will be constructive, if I can use that language, attribution, or destructive, exclusivist one, right? The kind of, I think politics is the hard work that we can't theorize, right? That's the stuff that we have to do, and it's easier said than done. That's the other problem. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think that one of the dangers of something like, putting hope in systemic crisis or immiseration is that it must lead to a better world because it's already pretty bad. It could lead to a worse world as well, right? And I think those mistakes were made by many radicals in the past, and I don't think we should repeat those mistakes. And I guess I'm a politics, I prioritize politics over immiseration.
Okay, so I'm going to use my position to ask a question finally. After all these years, I get to say something. I actually have a question for both of you. They're separate questions, but you can take them together if you want. So for Erik, you have the picture of Varoufakis' newest book up there. And one of the interesting points that he makes in there is to think about the ways in which user-generated content on digital platforms is a kind of labor contribution. He goes in kind of like a rent-seeking route. I don't know what to think about that exactly. But what I'm interested in particular here is thinking about the ways in which we might also think about the sort of entrepreneurial culture, not just in gig economy, digital platforms, but also in our leisure lives. Like, sort of building off of what Julia was talking about yesterday, and also some of Pascal's work thinking about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. In what ways have you seen, if at all, digital platforms sort of cultivating a kind of influencer or branding culture in people's leisure lives, such that, work and leisure kind of blur? We start to see this ambiguity. Obviously, it's not the exact same thing as direct selling, but there is something there, right, in terms of the sort of branding question. And then real quick to Igor, just so that I could not say anything anymore. And then Igor, the question for you is a question about competition within gig platforms themselves, and to what extent does that competition between workers potentially harm the possibility for membership, right? In a way that might be distinct from traditional firms where you don't have as clear competitive incentives between workers. I would like to know more about that.
So the analogy that first comes to mind is to the institution of the selling party, which is a very deep history, to this kind of period of the sort of reinvention of direct selling. Definitely continues, I mean, especially in the MLM world with Mary Kay, and also with Amway as well. And that's exactly, the purpose, I mean, in some sense, the managerial purpose of that strategy, which is so heavily pushed by the companies, is precisely to break down the line between work and leisure, and as Aaron was alluding to earlier, to, in some sense, commodify relationships and one's personal life. But definitely, I mean, again, it gets more intense over time, but the kind of opportunity, being constantly on the alert to convert opportunities for socializing into opportunities for selling or marketing, that seems to me to be kind of like offline, IRL version of the sort of social media marketing and selling.
I was just thinking there's an equivalent of counter movement when it comes to the influencers. And the only thing I've encountered, maybe a product of this influencing trend, is that people start filming themselves at the gym, and then they have all these viewers. Now people, it's sexist to it, with targets, but there seems to be a pushback against the use of quasi-public space for promotional purposes. And I don't know if that's also part of the influencing, kind of, it's just generated within the influencing tendency, but that's something that I found kind of weird about the whole thing. Now, your question is a very difficult one to answer. Let's start with the presupposition that our notion of membership is thin, right? In large part because we will have to wait for the empirical reality, right, to catch up, with our kind of ideal commitments. But, I have some hope when it comes to actually speaking with Uber drivers. So this platform setup, right, it's impersonal, right? So when you speak with actual workers, they're aware that they're being screwed over, right? They're aware that there are winners and there are losers, and they don't blame other workers for the losses. But the problem is they don't have kind of a system in place to organize and come together. That's something that has to be formed. So the hope I have, kind of in response to your skepticism, is that when you actually talk to these people, the attribution isn't other Uber workers or drivers, right? It's that there's this system, right, that is taking advantage of us, and then the hope is that we will be able to push back against it, and we are already in the process of doing that. But it's not a mistaken attribution that it's because there are other workers who are more efficient, right, than we are, right? But in terms of the prescriptive or the constructive dimension of how do you overcome the agonism, I think that's something that still needs to be, thought through. And, I guess we will see. And it's going to get worse and worse unless, the Uber workers, drivers, push for greater protections. And that'll bring them together, right? Hopefully in constructive ways.
I agree